Welcome to Not Two Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Chile, an attempt at historic compromise. The real story of the Allende years, by Jorge Palacios. Introduction. Chile is painfully notorious throughout the world for the devastating earthquakes that break out every 6 years or so. On September 11, 1973, however, the Chilean people became victim of a calamity much worse than all these disasters taken together: the military coup d'etat. In a country of only 10 million inhabitants, over 30,000 persons were murdered during the first 6 months of the dictatorship alone. More than 150,000 people went through the jails or the concentration camps. More than 500,000 Chileans had to leave the country because of political persecution or economic repression. The most brutal and sophisticated tortures, copied from the most sanguinary regimes, are used systematically as a normal method of interrogation or as a means of revenge or intimidation. But the repression does not only express itself through direct violence against individuals. It has resulted in the total destruction of the bourgeois democratic institutions and guarantees that had existed for decades in Chile. The parliament, the elections, the legal activities of all parties, the United Workers' Central, almost every single press and radio organ, as well as the television programs not under the control of the dictatorship, have been suppressed. Even humanitarian organizations set up by the church to assist the families of the persecuted have been dissolved. Out of the 110 articles of the Constitution in force before the coup d'etat, hardly more than a dozen remain in application. Through the Decree Law No. 28 of November 16, 1973, quote, "The government junta has taken over the constituent, legislative, and executive powers," end quote. Whenever one of these decrees violates the Constitution, the latter is considered to be amended by such a decree by virtue of the constituent power that the junta has attributed to itself. The most rigorous legislation and legal procedures have been used as a legal cover-up for the repressive trials, those of military courts operating in wartime. But even these laws and procedures of extreme harshness have not been respected, and in practice, absolute arbitrariness reigns supreme in matters of repression. More than 3 years after the coup d'etat, the country is still under the state of siege, martial law as well as a permanent curfew through the night. The most basic trade union rights have been abolished: rights to petition, to strike, to elect leaders, and to hold meetings. As far as this last right is concerned, it is not only forbidden to meet in public places, but an authorization is demanded even to hold private meetings of more than 6 persons. Tens of thousands of workers have been dismissed from their jobs without any recognition of the legal resource to which they were entitled in such cases. The military authorities interfere in education at all levels. The autonomy of the universities has been completely suppressed. Military administrators have been nominated in replacement of the rectors, and between 25 and 60%, depending on which university center, of the students and faculty have been expelled. A large number of chairs, as well as entire fields, have been arbitrarily suppressed because they were considered subversive. Just as during the medieval period, a policy of burning allegedly subversive books and literature has been initiated. The arbitrary actions of the Chilean fascist military against the most elementary human rights have earned the condemnation of many governments and international bodies, including the United Nations, the Organization of American States, the International Labor Organization, etc. Leopoldo Torres, General Secretary of the Catholic Jurists Movement and member of the International Jurists Commission, declared after the inquiry held in October 1973, when the repression had just begun, that, quote, "The situation and the criminal actions of the Chilean junta can be characterized as an attempted genocide, according to the definition of the United Nations Convention, end quote. The destruction of the institutions and of the most elementary rights provided by the bourgeois democracy in Chile, together with the crimes, tortures, and repression carried out by the fascist junta, represent just one side of the coin. All this repression is used in order to drastically and brutally expropriate the workers and large middle sectors of craftsmen, manufacturers, and tradesmen for the benefit of internal as well as imperialist monopoly capital and of the landed oligarchy. The economic genocide carried out against the people by the junta is even worse than the repressive genocide. The fascist junta has not only striven to provide the big internal exploiters and the foreign investors with cheap labor by means of repression. It has also effected the most monstrous transfer of purchasing power from the workers to big capital ever seen in our times. The part of the wage earners in the income distribution has fallen from $15,328 million during the 1970 to 1973 period to only $6,275 million for the period of 1974 to 1976. In other words, the workers have lost $9,053 million, a fall of about 60%. As for the small businessmen and independent workers, they have lost $179 million in income. One of the devices used to expropriate the workers and the middle strata for the benefit of big capital is the application of discriminatory taxes. The two social sectors just mentioned bore the cost of more than $400 million tax raise, while the latifundists, the national monopolies, and foreign capital benefited from a tax reduction of a similar amount. Another expropriation system is to proclaim freedom of pricing, which, because of the monopolistic structure of the main branches of production, has resulted in ever faster soaring prices. Just in the 12 months that followed the coup d'etat, inflation rose by more than 1,000%. In the meantime, the fascist military has continuously raised the rate of the dollar, twice a month, if not more often, thus favoring the imperialist monopolies and the big bourgeois exporters, as well as escalating the inflation process. Finally, expropriation was carried out through drastic cutbacks in public expenditure and in every budget relating to welfare services. One only needs to say that in 1977, the public health budget was reduced by half, while the army budget was multiplied by 4. As was to be expected, the steep drop in the purchasing power of the broad masses of the people, the tax increase that they suffered, together with the middle strata, the tightening of credit for the small and medium manufacturers and tradesmen, and the elimination of the protective tariff walls on imported goods, all this has generated a severe recession in productive and trade activities, as well as a massive process of failures for the small and medium enterprises. This was also deliberately sought by the fascist junta in order to promote the concentration of capital in the hands of the monopolistic sectors. This concentration was complemented with the restitution to their former owners, or the sale to new investors, of the firms nationalized by the Allende government and of the nationalized agricultural estates, as well as with huge compensation payments to the imperialist monopolies affected by the reforms of the said government. In 1976, 25% of the lands expropriated under the Frey and Allende governments had already been given back to their former owners, more than 2.97 million acres. Of a total of 494 enterprises, mainly factories, put under state control, 457 have already been restored. Even businesses created as state corporations before the Allende government have been handed over to the private sector. At the same time, more than $500 million has been paid out to the U.S. monopolies affected by the reforms of the Allende government, either in the form of compensation payments or of tax reductions. Even if the bankruptcy of the small and medium enterprises was part of the junta's policy of serving big capital, as with the brutal lowering of the standard of living of the masses, the fascist military has been bending over backwards in its slavishness to the promoters of the coup d'etat, causing a severe and almost uncontrollable economic crisis. An unbridled inflation and most serious recession have combined to destroy the Chilean economy, giving rise to the worst crisis in the history of this country. In 1975, the gross national product had already declined by 15%, reaching the lowest point since 1969, and the real national income had sunk by at least 26%, making the per capita income lower than that of 10 years ago. Industrial production alone registered a fall of 23% in 1975. Failures now begin to hit even large corporations, including the financial concerns where the pets of the regime used to speculate. What the Pinochet government has done in Chile is widely known and condemned throughout the world. The liberal British weekly The Observer sums up the general opinion in an article entitled "No to General Pinochet," when it says that the latter, quote, appears to be not only a cruel tyrant, but also an incompetent administrator, end quote. Also generally known are the economic and political, national, as well as international interests which formed a coalition in order to overthrow the Allende government. As far as the U.S. Senate Commission led by the Church is concerned, it made us familiar with even the details of the role played by the CIA in preparing the overthrow of the Allende government. A large number of books, pamphlets, articles, and films have come out to describe and analyze the political, economic, and military offensive launched by the most reactionary circles of Chile and assisted by the U.S. government in order to put an end to the reformist experiment attempted by the Popular Unity after it had gained the presidency of the Republic in 1970. But the more the facts come to light about the legal and illegal, open and underground, institutional and frankly subversive reactionary offensive waged by means of propaganda and sabotage, criminal attempts and armed actions that put an end to that peculiar experiment of socialism, the more inconceivable to everyone is the attitude of the Allende government and of the leading members of the political party supporting it. In particular, one cannot explain the attitude of the so-called Communist Party of Chile, which claims to be Marxist and which played a leading role in the activities of both the Popular Unity and the government. One cannot figure out why this government, with half the population on its side, particularly with the most vital and decisive sections of it, the workers and the peasants, did not mobilize them to smash the reactionary offensive. One cannot explain the government's attachment and submission to the laws and institutions that were not only controlled and used by the subversive opposition, but that were also continuously violated by them according to their putschist plans. The government's attitude towards the armed forces is also inconceivable. These armed forces were dependent on imperialism and were known to be repressive. Their putschist efforts, and even their aborted coup d'etat attempts, were ever more evident. However, the government professed, and propagated amongst the people, an unlimited confidence in the army and granted it excessive powers. One cannot explain the constant efforts by the Popular Unity government and leadership to extinguish the vigorous fighting spirit exhibited by the masses of the people, which included the use of repression on certain occasions. One cannot figure out why the government did not take advantage of the economic blockade and other forms of aggression by the U.S. government in order to develop an anti-imperialist popular mobilization which could have had repercussions on the continent. Finally, one cannot explain the desperate efforts made, in particular by the leaders of the CP, to enter into a pact, which was in fact a surrender offering, a compromise on key points of the government program, with the Christian Democratic Party, which was in fact manipulated by a team of known agents of U.S. imperialism led by Frey and some of the active organizers of the coup d'etat. Were the leaders of the CP, the real inspirers of the Popular Unity and of the government's policy, so naive that they believed that they could march to socialism by promoting the political and economic suicide of the ruling circles, and this by remaining within the framework of the law? Did they believe in the constitutional and purely professional spirit of an army which had massacred more than 10,000 workers since the beginning of the century, and which, faced in 1964 with the possibility of Allende being elected, made many offers to the U.S. Embassy to stage a coup d'etat? Moreover, when faced with the furious and multi-form offensive of the opposition forces and with putschist schemes, did they put their confidence in the legalist spirit of the Chileans to defend the government when they scorned any attempt to appeal to the masses? All these questions and many others remain without any answer from those who continue to pretend that under the Allende government there was a real attempt to establish socialism in Chile. The policy of the Popular Unity leaders, particularly those of the CP, who claim to be Marxists, is even more paradoxical if we consider that the reactionary opposition forces, together with the CIA, developed their offensive against the Allende government with tactics much closer to Marxist tactics than those of the so-called Marxists. They combined legal and illegal struggle, open and underground work. They mobilized the masses around their demands, but with the clear intention of overthrowing the government. They used the laws and institutions against it, and they bypassed them when it suited their aims, etc. In this book, we intend to clarify the reasons behind all these mysteries stemming from the basic policies of the Popular Unity and its government. In order to do so, it is essential to denounce the real motivations behind the two basic formulations, the two pillars of the Chilean CP strategy that were decisive in this experience: the so-called peaceful road to power, and the efforts made to achieve a sort of historic compromise with the leaders of the pro-Yankee populist forces. The mistakes involved in such a strategy and its ever more evident bankruptcy, evident of course for those who sincerely believed that they were marching to socialism because of Allende's electoral victory, gave rise to intense struggles within the Popular Unity. This increased the confusion, the paralyzation, and in the final analysis, the vulnerability of the Allende government. But the most fundamental mistake was to believe that through the peaceful road and the historic compromise, the CP leaders wanted to achieve genuine socialism, and that these were just erroneous strategies and opportunist deviations followed by them. In this manner, the real reactionary and fully conscious origin of the politics carried by the Chilean CP leaders were not seen through, nor was their servile subordination to the strategy put forward by the Soviet Union and Latin America in order to contend for hegemony with the United States. In this manner, the real reactionary and fully conscious origin of the politics carried out by the Chilean CP leaders was not seen through, nor was their servile subordination to the strategy put forward by the Soviet Union and Latin America in order to contend for hegemony with the United States. Their plan to establish in Chile, along with a counterfeit socialism as in the USSR and in the countries of the Warsaw Treaty, also remained unexposed. It is precisely because this strategy, based on reactionary motivations, was considered as a mistake, as a pure opportunist deviation, and because it was combated as such, that it was able to maintain itself as a dominant trend within the Popular Unity and the government. This led to the present tragedy. As soon as we consider the model of socialism advocated by the pro-Soviet leaders of the Chilean CP, a state capitalism similar to that created as a result of the degeneration of socialism in the USSR and in the Eastern European countries dependent on her, the peaceful road strategy that they preach to the people becomes fully coherent and clear. It is precisely because they only want to replace one system of exploitation by another, and because they wish to substitute a bureaucratic bourgeoisie issued from their ranks for the traditional big bourgeoisie and some monopolies, that they are forced, first and foremost, to oppose the revolutionary mobilization of the people and anything that could lead them to the seizure of political power. Therefore, they were forced to maintain the laws and institutions of the bourgeois state and to make sure that they were not destroyed by the people in their revolutionary offensive. This would have meant the failure of their plan to replace one system of exploitation and oppression by another. That is why they limited themselves to bringing pressure on the traditional sectors of the bourgeoisie by demagogically mobilizing the masses, but only in order to bargain on the basis of their capacity to maintain the people within the limits of the existing laws and institutions, and to blackmail the bourgeoisie with the threat that the people might come under genuine revolutionary leadership. But they are as much afraid as the traditional bourgeoisie that the people will really embark on the revolutionary road. The necessity to oppose revolution in order to pave the way for a farce of socialism is the essence of the peaceful road to socialism advocated by the sham communists as a strategy for the people. If the pro-Soviet so-called communists, in preaching this strategy, have completely abandoned Marxism, it has to be very clear that it is not because of simple ideological deviations or mistakes, but because their aims themselves are anti-Marxist and reactionary. It would therefore be quite naive and vain to try and convince them of their opportunism. On the other hand, It must be clearly seen that the strategy put forward by these sham communists of following the peaceful road to power is one thing, and that the methods they use when the time comes to establish their state capitalism under socialist disguise are quite another. The peaceful road formulation is designed to prevent the people from rebelling and seizing power through violence, but it does not in the least prevent these sham communists from calling in their armed forces to maintain their own political power, as they did in Czechoslovakia or in Angola. It does not prevent them from using armed mercenaries as in Zaire, nor from resorting to a coup d'état by the infiltration of the bourgeois armed forces, as they tried to do in the Congo. It does not hinder them from infiltrating anti-imperialist governments as they did in Cuba. Even though the goal is always the same, regimes of state exploitation of the people with Soviet social imperialism pulling the strings, the methods differ according to time and place. Where there is direct domination by the USSR, social imperialism resorts to armed intervention, as in Czechoslovakia, to crush any attempt at independence or subversion of state capitalism. In regions where the domination of the other superpower, US imperialism, is relatively weak, as in Africa and certain regions of Asia, state power is also seized through violence, even though the USSR acts in an underhanded manner. On the other hand, in Western Europe and in America, where US influence predominates, it seems that the strategy is to avoid open challenge, for the time being, with US imperialism and with the forces that are close to it and not to establish its socialist model of the Eastern European type. Instead, an alliance is forced with the populist sectors under United States influence in order to infiltrate the government and state apparatus and engage in joint exploitation of the people together with the ruling circles or a section of them at the expense of the others. This is the precise mission the pro-Soviet so-called communists had, and still have, to accomplish in Chile. From there stems their active promotion of the line of peaceful road, preventing any mobilization of the people aimed at blocking the road to the reactionary offensive. That is why, at the same time, they made an active use of the devastating effects of this offensive in order to impose, at all costs, a pact with Frey and his team. This very orientation explains why today they are still actively opposing any resistance meant to overthrow the Chilean military junta, and they are putting forward as the only alternative the replacement of the dictatorship by a Christian democratic government, in which they hope to participate, even if it is only in the far future. Thus, they remain loyal to the basis of their strategy, peaceful road, forbidding the people to rebel against the dictatorship and historic compromise with the pro-Yankee populist forces. While under the Allende government, they preferred to sacrifice the people to fascism instead of letting them fight and open the way to power, today they prefer their submission to the dictatorship and the prolongation of their sufferings to the possibility of an insurrection which could make their own plan fail. They only accept the replacement of this open dictatorship with a veiled dictatorship that would keep the bourgeois state apparatus intact, including the armed forces which exercise the dictatorship. Besides the basic theses that we have just formulated, we show in this book that the Soviet Union openly disregarded the possibility of openly defending the Allende regime, economically and still less militarily, because it did not correspond to the strategic model they proposed for Latin America. We show how the Popular Unity government, under CP hegemony, would not have led to genuine socialism, even if it had been successful in implementing its program, unless the people, under revolutionary leadership, would have rebelled and fought against its opportunist leadership. We also refute the cynical line of the CP leadership, according to which it is the ultra-leftists who are responsible for the failure of the Allende government. This line is designed to cover up their open sabotage of any real advance towards socialism, as well as their own responsibility for the rise of fascism. We show that the middle strata turned against the Allende government not because of simple tactical mistakes in dealing with them, but because of the control of political power by the most reactionary strata, and because the opportunist leadership of the Popular Unity refused to lead the people in fighting the reactionaries. In the various chapters, we give detailed analysis of the character of the Chilean armed forces, showing their repressive and anti-people history, and providing detailed denunciation of the praising campaigns organized for them by the CEP in particular. We show their dependence on U.S. imperialism and refute the thesis according to which they were constitutionalist beyond and above any class role. We also refute the thesis that, quote, it is just a handful of traitors who misled them away from their purely professional role, end quote, and that, quote, until the last few months, they were reluctant to unleash a coup d'etat, end quote. Besides the interest and opinions that the theses defended in this work may arouse, we made a particular effort to prove everything we assert with extensive and detailed quotations, based on a thorough rereading of all the main newspapers of the government and opposition during the 3 years of the Allende government, as well as of a large number of publications that came out during this period and since the coup d'etat. Thus, for those who do not agree with the conclusions that we draw, this study will have at least some documentary value. This documentary analysis comprises a study of the origin of the peaceful road thesis in Chile, as well as an extensive account of documents dealing with the manner in which Allende's government was used, in Chile and abroad, in order to promote this thesis. Based on these documents, we also analyzed the economic policy of the Allende government, the nationalization process, the crisis of the state economy, the effects of the economic sabotage perpetrated by the opposition and the U.S. government, the magnitude of the reforms applied by the government, and the powerful interests that the government was hitting at. We also carry out a documented analysis of the conflict between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, about Chile, as well as the expression of this conflict within the country. We examine chronologically the use made by the opposition of the parliament, the courts, the Contraloria, General Audit of the Republic, and other institutions to obstruct all action of the executive and prepare its overthrow. We include a documentary analysis of the CIA's activity in preparing the coup d'etat, particularly within the army. We provide a well-documented study on the political contradictions and differences operating within the various political forces comprising the opposition, the Popular Unity, and the other anti-putschist forces besides it. In this respect, we include a critical analysis of the weaknesses of the leftist opposition to the dominant line of the Popular Unity and the government. Finally, we further analyze the positions of the various political forces and their activities during the 3 years that followed the coup d'etat, on the basis of their documents and their practical activity. Even though such an investigation requires a considerable effort, particularly in exile conditions, so that it is based on objective evidence, it is not an uncommitted work, a pure sociological analysis. It is an effort to develop a Marxist-Leninist analysis of the concrete reality of our country and of what took place there. First and foremost, we want to assert that it is not Marxism nor socialism that failed in Chile, and that this theory, by ridding itself of its falsifiers and combined with the heroic fighting capacity of our people, will lead us to national liberation and genuine socialism. Jorge Palacios, January 1977. Part 1. Ideological background to the political failure of the Popular Unity. Chapter 1. Prehistory of the Chilean Road to Socialism. In order to understand the origins of the Chilean road to socialism, it is essential to analyze the legal and constitutional context in which the Chilean politics developed and the role played by the pro-Soviet Communist Party of Chile. Chile appeared as an exceptional country in Latin America. It was considered as the England of Latin America because for a long time, a certain bourgeois democratic legality and institutionality remained in force. Indeed, despite the fact that almost all the constitutions which govern Chile have been imposed through military pressures, it can be said that there was an old tradition of legalism and bourgeois democracy in this country. Even though the anti-communist repression, launched by the González Videla government and continued during almost the entire following one, was violating the spirit of the Constitution, it was nevertheless legislated through the parliament, the so-called Law to Defend Democracy. On the other hand, the bourgeois democratic traditions played a decisive role in the arguments put forward by the leaders of the Communist Party of Chile when they were propagating their theory on the so-called peaceful road to socialism. but to a large extent, these traditions owe their existence precisely to the influence of this party and the reformist character of the opposition policy it followed for decades in Chile. 1. The whys and wherefores of bourgeois democracy in Chile. The Communist Party of Chile was born a few years after the victory of the Socialist Revolution in Russia. It deeply integrated with the proletariat of the saltpeter mines operated by imperialist countries. Its founder, Luis Emilio Recabarren, was a great organizer for the working class press in the country. Later on, with the relatively fast industrial development of Chile in the context of dependent countries, its militant activity spread throughout the country. Its growing influence is explained by the prestige of the Bolshevik Revolution of Lenin and Stalin's time, and by its role as the builder of the first workers' organizations that took up the demands of the workers and peasants. Later on the eve of the Second World War, the party began to play a leading role in the bourgeois electoral and parliamentary politics, using its mass influence for the creation of broad anti-fascist fronts that were to bring to the presidency of the Republic the first men who did not belong to the traditional right-wing parties. Finally, after the war, the party reinforced its bureaucratic and propaganda apparatus. In 1947, it obtained the first significant portion of the vote in the country, winning almost 100,000 votes in the municipal elections before it was outlawed. In 1965, it got almost 300,000 votes, representing then 12.4% of the total. In 1967, it reached 14.7% with 341,700 votes, and in 1969, on the eve of the elections that were to bring about the triumph of Allende, it won 15.9% of the total votes, with 380,700. As for the Socialist Party, under the hegemony of the CP since the 1950s, it got between 250,000 and 300,000 votes in the last three elections just mentioned. Until the birth of groups of Cuban inspiration and the Revolutionary Communist Party of Chile in the 1960s, the old Communist Party of Chile had the prestige of being the only spokesman for the masses of workers and peasants, and undoubtedly it was the only party with genuine roots in these classes. The only ones who had ever questioned this role were some weak and isolated Trotskyite groups and a socialist party internally undermined by numerous factions and without any clear and consistent alternative line. Furthermore, during the 1950s, after a short-lived populist deviation which caused a large number of its rank and file to split and support General Carlos Ibáñez for president 1952 to 1958, the Socialist Party submitted entirely to the electoral blocs and the strategy put forward by the CP. Because of its mass influence and the hegemony of its class collaborationist politics over the traditional left-wing forces, the Communist Party of Chile has been largely responsible for the preservation of the legal and institutional system of exploitation that remained in force until the coup d'etat. The maintenance of the bourgeois legality and institutionality until September 11, 1973, allowed the ruling classes to enrich themselves and to exploit the people without the risks involved in resorting to an open and brutal dictatorship that could have aroused a revolutionary opposition as a counterpart. Moreover, as a supplement to this legality and this institutionality is the real foundation of the regime of exploitation, the ruling classes relied on the armed forces and the police, ready to violently suppress any protest that would bypass the limits acceptable and constitute a potential threat to the regime. In fact, any vigorous popular protest against the worst forms of exploitation was always considered as a threat to the system of exploitation and brutally suppressed. Thus, the people, lacking a revolutionary orientation, were held for many years, quote, between the sword and the wall, end quote. Between the sword of the military and the wall of an institutionality and legality basically opposed to their interests. In this context, the docile opposition into which the leadership of the Chilean CP had misled the left explains, to a large extent, the whys and wherefores of the survival of certain relatively stable forms of bourgeois democracy in our country. Far from jeopardizing the regime of exploitation, the Chilean CP, one of the most influential in the capitalist world, if not the most influential, considering the population of the country, played an important role in its preservation. This was done by promoting respect for and submission to the existing laws and institutions, by launching, within such a framework, purely economist and conciliating actions to support their demands, by reducing any aspiration for power to mere electoralist attempts during the presidential elections every 6 years, and finally, once defeated in these elections, by acquiescing to collaborate with the government to form a legalist opposition within the limits tolerated by the ruling classes. Many honest rank-and-file militants of the Chilean CP, who were told that the democratic traditions of Chile were making possible the seizure of power through the peaceful road, would be quite surprised to learn that in the main, these traditions were maintained because they were inefficient as revolutionaries, and nay more, because they were successful in leading broad strata of the population into a purely reformist road. It is precisely because of this that the Chilean CP was allowed to send its leaders to parliament, even though it was claiming to be Marxist. It is because of this that it was permitted to set up enterprises of a capitalist type belonging to the party, to openly control a series of trade union organizations, to create with other forces a whole movement based on electoral politics, and to set up a legal bureaucratic party machine with printing press, journals, and radios, with political quarters and hiring thousands of officials. But later, the reward for all these successes, materialized in the electoral conquest of the presidency of the Republic, was to be the destruction and fire and blood of all that had been gained during half a century of patient and peaceful work. Had the militants of the Chilean CP been consistent with Marxism, as they claimed to be, they would have understood that the elections in which they believed so much as a means of taking power were nothing but security valves for the exploitation system. They represented the possible variations of a rigid system, and their sole use was to maintain the illusion that it was possible to rely on such mechanisms to change the system against the will of the ruling classes. However, as the facts have eloquently shown, those who controlled power had no intention of tolerating a real modification to their system that would harm their interests and privileges without opposing it by force. Not only that, it was glaring that they were ready to even destroy their institutionality and legality as soon as they would be used against their interests. Even the election results to which the sham Marxists were attributing some magical power were no more than the thermometer that comes with any security valve. Those holding power and the main instruments of production were using them to periodically assess the level reached by the opposition, channeled and institutionalized through the electoral system, and to determine what concessions or restrictions were necessary. And more importantly, the election results were used by them in order to establish a limit beyond which it was dangerous that the opposition, even institutionalized, used the system to promote its own interests. As is shown from the maneuvers deployed to prevent Allende from becoming president of the Republic, this limit came to the fore when the latter took over the executive power and showed willingness to use it in order to undertake reforms that were going to hit hard at the interests of the ruling classes. Under such conditions, the previous benefits of the electoral system as a moderating element, designed only to keep the people off the revolutionary path, had, to a certain extent, transformed into their opposite, into a threat to the ruling classes. The exploitation of legality within the framework of the bourgeois institutions and the dissemination of opportunist ideology among the masses by the Chilean CP leaders were two complementary aspects of the same reality, two sides of the same coin. However, the existence of such a bourgeois democracy and the possibility to enter the parliament were the central arguments of the revisionist trend dominating the Chilean CP, the possibility for the people to seize political power through the peaceful road. Thus, they were presenting as a specific and essential feature of the Chilean political process something which was basically the consequence of their class collaborationist politics, allowing U.S. imperialism and local reactionaries to exploit the people without having to resort to open dictatorship. They were subjectively transforming a temporary particularity of this process, a result of the lack of revolutionary leadership, into an alleged law governing this process. In order to understand how the experience of the popular unity government and the Chilean road to socialism, so much talked about, were arrived at, it is now necessary to briefly look into the policy of the Communist Party of Chile, which paved the way to such an experience. 2. The policy of popular fronts. After the formation of anti-fascist fronts just before the Second World War, the Chilean CP followed a policy of broad alliance with other bourgeois political forces and succeeded in creating the electoral conditions that brought their candidates into the government. These united front alliances were a correct response to the rise of world fascism, as well as an important method to unite, in dependent countries such as Chile, broad sectors under the hegemony of the proletariat. However, in our country, they actually remained under the leadership of the bourgeoisie. Moreover, the Chilean CP leadership, which was supposed to guarantee proletarian hegemony over the United Front, was entirely dominated by bourgeois ideas, and the party was put in the service of the rising bourgeois sectors. The first of these anti-fascist coalitions to win victory was the Popular Front, which presented Pedro Aguirre Cerda as candidate for the presidency of the Republic in 1938. This candidate, the first president to be elected with the support of the CP, was a member of the Radical Party, led by a hodgepodge of right-wing elements with various others of social democratic tendency. During the election campaign, a modest reformist program was put forward in which the proposed reforms to the labor code, the unionization of the peasants, the dissolution of the National Agricultural Society, organization of the big landlords, and the reorganization of the administration. At no time did the CP leaders propose, even in their own documents as an independent line, a program for people's democratic transformations. They never advocated a genuine revolutionary strategy of seizing power other than through elections. They simply submitted to the modest program of the bourgeois candidate, and they accepted elections as the only road to power. When Aguirre Cerda was elected, none of the points in the program was implemented, and as far as the most important one was concerned, the unionization of the peasants, the CP leaders agreed with the government to postpone it indefinitely. Later, after the Second World War had broken out, the Chilean CP, according to confessions made afterwards by its own leaders, fell into the anti-Marxist deviation initiated by Browder, the then General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States. His thesis was that after the defeat of fascism, there would be an agreement between the victorious capitalist countries and the socialist camp. According to him, this agreement would bring about a tremendous improvement of the living conditions of the masses, rapid industrialization, and independence of the countries oppressed by imperialism, and a long period of peace, making possible a peaceful transition to socialism. Browder was actually a predecessor for the opportunist theses later put forward by Nikita Khrushchev. He himself recognizes this in 1960 when he says, quote, "Nikita Khrushchev has now adopted the heresy for which I was expelled from the CP in 1945. It is the same line, almost word for word, that I defended 15 years ago. Thus," end quote, he concludes, quote, "my crime has been converted, at least for the time being, into the new orthodoxy," end quote. It is in this way that the anti-fascist National Union was understood by the CP leaders, strongly influenced by Browderism, as an almost total renunciation, not only of the struggle for power, but of class struggle itself. In an article published in Principios, theoretical organ of the Central Committee of the CP of Chile, Humberto Abarca, national leader, praises the reactionary politician Cruz Koch for the, quote, largeness of mind, end quote, and, quote, clarity, end quote, that he exhibited when he said in a meeting that, quote, the division between right and left is artificial. To pose the problem of class struggle in this manner is wrong. We have to give a new sense to capitalism, because Chile needs capital, end quote. As for Carlos Contreras Labarca, General Secretary of the CP, he shamelessly quotes the Wall Street Journal, daily newspaper of the American bankers, to demonstrate that, quote, our countries hope that the United States and the great powers will follow a policy aimed at developing our economies and improving the standard of living and consumption capacity of our populations, and that this is not based on declarations or vague hopes, but on serious facts, end quote. Later, under the presidency of Juan Antonio Rios, also elected by the votes of the old Chilean CP, Elias Laferet, leader and founder of the party, presented the following program in 1945, in a report submitted to the 16th plenum of the Central Committee. Quote, an agrarian reform within the existing juridical framework, trying, end quote, he adds, quote, to be as beneficial as possible to the peasant masses and not to the big landlords, end quote. To achieve this, he proposes to expropriate the big landlords, quote, with reasonable compensation, and to hand over the land to the peasants who will pay for it on a long-term basis, end quote. As anti-imperialist measures, this draft program only proposes, quote, the revision of the concessions made to the large foreign companies in order to ensure a greater respect of national sovereignty and life of the natives, end quote, claiming, however, that in the meantime, quote, we must attract foreign capital so that it fulfills the role it is assigned to by the good neighbor policy, end quote. The aspirations of the CP leaders to gain power were thus reduced to becoming members of some ministerial cabinet together with, quote, all democratic parties and sectors without exception, end quote. In order to achieve this, they devote, quote, maximum energy, end quote, according to their own words, to convince the opposition parties, including the party of the President of the Republic, to enter their government. Quote, our party, end quote, says Senator Laferte, quote, made every possible effort to convince the leaders of the Radical Party and the Socialist Party of the necessity to give up their policy of opposing the President of the Republic and to achieve an agreement with him so as to promote a progressive policy, end quote. 3. The line of the post-war period. 6 months after these declarations, at the end of 1945, the 13th Congress of the Communist Party of Chile was held. According to the official history, the Browderite and opportunist line was then swept away. In fact, once the war was over and the conciliation dreams of Browder were smashed by real life, once Browder himself had been severely criticized by the international communist movement because of his arch-opportunism, and once the contradictions between the Soviet Union and the United States had sharpened, it was then recognized that the CP of Chile, quote, had suffered from alien influence which had led it to opportunist deviations, end quote. And that, quote, these erroneous views had temporarily weakened the fighting spirit of the party, endangered the independence of its politics, and prevented it from playing its role as the leader in the vanguard, end quote. However, the report submitted to this Congress contains no revolutionary strategy or program to replace the previous line recognized as opportunist. On the contrary, in this very report, Contreras Labarca, General Secretary of the CP, continues to beg that his party should be admitted into the bourgeois government, following the old tradition of the party leadership. Quote, the CP, end quote, he says, quote, considers its participation in this cabinet as essential and will fight along with the people to enter this government, end quote. Regarding imperialism, the, quote, revision of the foreign concessions, end quote, put forward by Elias Laferte is not even raised during the 13th Congress. On the contrary, Contreras Labarca upholds that, quote, the doors of Chile must be opened to foreign capital, end quote. On international politics, it is said that, quote, the guarantee for peace and international security, for the reconstruction of world independence, democracy, and well-being, end quote, would be, quote, the unity between the three great powers, the United States, England, and the Soviet Union, end quote. In the middle of 1946, the Chilean CP launches a new election campaign in support of González Videla of the Radical Party, nominated during a convention involving a number of parties. If the problem of division of large estates, which of course never took place, is raised, absolutely no anti-imperialist measures are put forward, and quite the contrary, the policy of good neighborhood is persistently advocated as, quote, a means to win over the collaboration of the United States, end quote. In the beginning of the González Videla government, the CP leaders finally obtained participation in a ministerial government, as they had hoped and begged for a long time. They are put in charge of 3 departments. This immediately results in frenzied calls for class conciliation, under the hoax that it is necessary to increase production and to support a government in which the communists are participating. The demands of the masses are restrained in the most scandalous and open manner. In the beginning of 1947, the General Secretary of the CP writes, quote, the provocateur elements are being expelled from the trade union organizations. the working class understands its responsibility as a leading force in front of the government. The workers have enthusiastically supported the call of the Communist Party to increase production and to solve their problems and fulfill their needs by making full use of all the necessary procedures and by resorting to strike only as an exceptional measure." End quote. In the report to the 6th Congress of the Santiago region, the CP says, quote, "Faced with the immediate task of collaborating with the government in the battle to increase production, the Confederation of Chilean Workers and our party have solemnly declared that without giving up the sacred right to strike, it would be used only as the ultimate resort, after all other means of agreement with the employers and enterprises will have been exhausted." End quote. The report castigates the irresponsible provocateurs who, quote, "want the working class to launch improvised and artificial strikes against the government." End quote. Galo González, later to become General Secretary of the CP, upholds that, quote, "the party will make all possible efforts to ensure that the labor conflicts will be solved in harmony between the employers and the workers." End quote. Despite these great services rendered by the leadership of the CP to the bourgeois government, the communist ministers were expelled from the government after the municipal elections of 1947, in which the CP got a large number of votes. The government legislated the unionization of the peasants in order to prevent any real organization in the countryside. Quite upset, a leader of the old CP commented, quote, "We are faced with a paradoxical thing. The communists are forced out of the government because the people support them more warmly with every passing day." End quote. It is obvious that such a paradox is incomprehensible only to those who never reasoned from a genuinely Marxist standpoint. Despite their expulsion from the government, the CP leaders carried on with their politics of conciliation with the latter. Quote, "We will support all the measures taken by the government for the implementation of the program. We will not engage in opposition for opposition's sake. We will develop a constructive and realistic policy." End quote. As usual, the question of taking power and developing a revolutionary strategy in order to do so was completely left out of the declarations of these communist leaders. In October 1947, González Videla used the army and the police to encircle the coal miners of Lota, who were on legal strike, and he issued a compulsory back-to-work decree. He forbade the members of parliament to enter the zone and imposed censorship on the left-wing press. He requisitioned food from the homes of the strikers, and he established summary courts on warships. Thousands of the strikers' families were forcibly removed to every corner of the country, and they were left there, deprived of the most basic necessities. A series of arrests was launched throughout the country against the activists of the Communist Party who were jailed or put under home surveillance, or thrown in concentration camps. All those suspected of being members of the party were expelled from their jobs. The following year, the parliament approved legislation called the Law to Defend Democracy, depriving all CP members of their civil and political rights and providing for jail terms as well as other hard measures to deal with any party activity, propaganda, or organizing. Later, the sharpening of the contradictions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the obvious role of U.S. imperialism and the repression that was rampant in Chile, resulted in some progress in the program of the Communist Party of Chile. Thus, in 1949, a Program for National Salvation was developed. It considered the expropriation without compensation of the large land estates, the free nationalization of the public unity companies, and the source of raw materials in the hands of the United States, and the expropriation of private banks and insurance companies. There were also other measures to improve the standard of living of the people and for the democratization of the country. However, even if this political manifesto advocates the, quote, overthrow of the present government and its replacement with a democratic, representative government, end quote, there is no definition for this new type of government, no explanation as to the role of the proletariat in it, and no revolutionary strategy is developed for the seizure of political power. The systematic persecutions launched by González Videla reduced the number of the members of the old CP to less than 3,000, half of whom were newcomers, recruited during the repression period. The others, trained for electoralist and economist struggle, could not resist such a repression and left the party. Under such circumstances, with the hard lessons of the repression, the struggle between opposing trends within the CP leadership came up all the more strongly. One tendency, the minority, upheld the necessity to overthrow the González Videla dictatorship. The other one, for its part, only wished to restore legality by making pledges to the ruling class that its true aim was to respect the bourgeois democratic laws and institutions. The rightists within the CP leadership, taking advantage of the fact that their opponents were dispersed all over the country, began to co-opt into the leading bodies all sorts of elements having similar ideas to theirs and who had been members of the Central Committee Annex Commissions. These individuals, many of whom were former Trotskyites, were linked with the Freemasonry or had taken open anti-communist stands, were to take over the key positions in the leadership. Because of these maneuvers, the opponents of conciliation became a minority in the leading bodies and began to develop factional activities from the National Organizing Commission of the CP and from a work group created by the Commission. However, isolated from the masses and even from the party rank and file, they undertook a series of putschist actions against the dictatorship. These actions were used by their opponents in order to discredit them, and finally, in 1950, they were expelled from the party. The consequences of the takeover of the CP leadership by the most right-wing faction did not take long to come. In the middle of that year, they developed a document program known as the Emergency Plan, which is a definite regression compared to the previous Plan for National Salvation. The slogan for the nationalization of the imperialist enterprises was replaced by that of, quote, protection, in terms convenient to the country, of the national production against imperialist competition, suspension of the payment of the external debt as long as the crisis persists, obligation for the companies to have their administration in Chile itself, end quote. The agrarian reform was reduced to the, quote, obligation to cultivate the non-exploited lands, assistance to all cultivators, big or small, interested in increasing production, requisition, during the periods of crisis, of the uncultivated lands that their owners refused to put in production, end quote. Galo González, General Secretary of the Chilean CP, justified these concessions compared to the previous program with the unity that must be built, because, quote, all the activities of the party and all the people's struggles must be merged, linked, and developed on the basis of the struggle for peace, end quote. Just before the 1952 presidential elections, in which Salvador Allende was presented for the first time, the CP united with a section of the Socialist Party, and under the pressure of this ally, it came back to the slogans calling for the agrarian reform and the nationalization of foreign enterprises. During the elections, a large number of the CP activists were deleted from the electoral lists because of the law to defend democracy. Allende suffered his first defeat and got only 5.45% of the vote. General Carlos Ibáñez triumphed. This man had already been head of a dictatorial government during the world crisis and was responsible for large-scale penetration of North American capital in Chile. Even though it had denounced these facts during the election campaign, the political commission of the CP said, after the victory of Ibáñez, quote, the Communist Party is willing to make a resolute contribution so that the government of Mr. Carlos Ibáñez can act for the benefit of the country. It will support all practical measures that this government will adopt for the benefit of the people and of the nation, end quote. And, forgetting as usual the problem of taking power, quote, our attitude, inspired by the sole desire of serving the people, will be one of patriotic collaboration to solve the problems and of patriotic and constructive opposition to government actions inconvenient to the masses of the people and to Chile, end quote. Even after 1 year of the reactionary Carlos Ibáñez government, which was continuing to implement the repressive legislation of the previous government, the leadership of the CP stated, in Principios, the theoretical organ of its Central Committee, quote, our goal is to try to harmoniously solve the conflicts between labor and capital by using all possible means, and we advocate resorting to strike, a right recognized by the Labor Code, only after all other means have failed, end quote. 4. The 20th Congress of the CPSU and the Peaceful Road. The opportunist line of the CP leaders was to receive, later, and international support from the Soviet leaders when the orientation revising Marxism adopted during the 20th Congress of the CPSU became public. When the 20th Congress of the CPSU was held, the leaders of the CP of Chile had not had a Congress for 11 years. However, a few months after the political turn in the USSR, the 10th Congress of the CP was hastily held without any prior discussion, only to impose, in Chile, the theses formulated by Khrushchev, in particular, those concerning the peaceful road to socialism. It must be remembered that during the 20th Congress of the CPSU, Khrushchev and other ideologues of modern revisionism raised the slogan of, quote, using the parliamentary road for the transition to socialism, end quote, and declared that, quote, today, the international and national conditions favorable for the working class of a series of capitalist countries to accomplish the socialist revolution through the peaceful road are being created, end quote. In January 1961, in Principios, Luis Corbalán declared, echoing the Soviets, that, quote, the great merit of the 20th Congress of the CPSU is that it re-established the validity of the peaceful road rejected by the communist movement after Lenin's death, even as an exceptional possibility, end quote. And in issue number 35 of the same magazine, giving a good illustration of his tailism regarding the Soviets, he said, quote, this question, the peaceful road, had been raised from the prominent tribune of the 20th Congress of the CPSU. In Chile itself, we had demonstrated the possibility of using the parliamentary road to lead the people's forces to power. But this question was not sufficiently clear to us. Now, we clearly see that such a possibility also exists for us in Chile. If we destroy the anti-democratic handiwork of González Videla and democratize the country, there is no doubt that new, promising perspectives will open before us for the democratic transformation of our society, without waiting for nor creating a situation favorable to insurrection, end quote. From the 20th Congress of the CPSU onward, the activities of the CP leaders were centered around the restitution of the CP's legal and electoral rights, so that it could arrive at government through the peaceful road. Allende's election was nothing but the culminating point, as well as the tragic conclusion of this path. In 1957, the year following the 20th Congress of the CPSU, Luis Corbalán, already General Secretary of the CP, issued a statement calling upon the reactionaries to restore the civil rights of the CP. This statement is a monstrous abjuration of the basic principles of Marxism. During the 24th plenum of the Central Committee, he declared, quote, we want and demand our civil liberties. And we solemnly declare that once we will be free to operate in the political life, we will not be of any threat to any respectable interest. We are in favor of solving everything democratically, in accordance with the majority of the country and within the free play of all parties and trends. We do not advocate today the substitution of collective property for the private property of the Chilean capitalists. And when tomorrow we will move over to this task, we think that it will also have to be done with the agreement of the majority of Chileans, through the peaceful road and securing the rights and welfare of the capitalists, that is, providing them with due compensation, end quote. Naturally, after such a commitment, the civil rights of the CP were restored. A party with such an orientation represented no danger for the exploiters in their system. On the contrary, it was rendering them an invaluable service by bringing the masses of the people under its influence to set the pace for the legalist and electoralist political maneuverings that would never seriously jeopardize their power. It is tempting to quote here an ironical comment made by Marx and Engels concerning a similar attitude of the German Social Democratic Party. Quote, let the party therefore prove, end quote, they write, quote, by its humble and lowly manner, that it has once and for all laid aside the improprieties and excesses which occasioned the anti-socialist law. If it voluntarily promises that it intends to act only within the limits of this law, Bismarck and the bourgeoisie will surely have the kindness to repeal it, as it will then be superfluous, end quote. But in the case of Chile, there had not even been the improprieties and excesses on the part of the CP, and González Videla, as he confided to an English reporter of the New Chronicle, had launched the repression against this party because he believed that a new world war, this time between the United States and the Soviet Union, would break out in the coming months, and he wanted to be one of the first Latin American leaders to side with the United States. Under the governments that followed that of Carlos Ibáñez, those of Jorge Alessandri and Eduardo Frei, the leaders of the Chilean CP persisted in implementing a policy of putting a brake on class struggle and developing a conciliatory opposition to the government of the moment. Quote, "For everyone knows," end quote, Lenin writes, quote, "that the histories of all revolutions the world over reveals an inevitable, rather than accidental, transformation of the class struggle into civil war," end quote. Therefore, the basic role of these sham Marxists was indeed to pit themselves against class struggle in order to prevent any evolution towards civil war, and so that they could continue their dreams of peacefully taking power. These conciliatory politics led President Alessandri, a government representative of the most reactionary circles of the country, to issue a certificate of good behavior to the leaders of the CP, declaring at the end of his mandate that during his administration there had been no serious problem with this party, because it was an organization respectful of the laws and democratic life. During the Frei administration, they continued to practice a basically verbal opposition and to obstruct, in fact, the struggles of the people. At the end of 1967, following the guidelines and demands of the American-controlled financial organization, the International Monetary Fund, the Frei government put forward a wage readjustment plan aimed at shifting onto the back of the workers the effects of the crisis seriously aggravated during the last years of its administration. On December 13, 1967, Luis Corbalán said, referring to this readjustment plan, quote, "In general, to vote in favor of this project means to turn on the green light for this retrogressive policy. To vote against it does not amount to refusing any wage legislation. It means voting against the retrogressive policy of the government and creating conditions so that it will table a different plan," end quote. After this readjustment plan was unanimously rejected, the government tabled before the parliament a plan described by the CP leaders as, quote, "more reactionary than the previous one," end quote. However, after secret negotiations with the Christian Democratic leaders, the CP members of parliament turned on the green light for the second plan by voting for its inclusion on the agenda. In order to justify this betrayal of the workers' interests before public opinion, they said that the negative aspects of the plan would be eliminated during the article-by-article discussion in Parliament. This was but a sham and hypocritical justification aimed at concealing their compromise with the Frei government, since they knew perfectly well that the traditional left did not have enough votes to change these articles once the plan was on the agenda. Thus, in May 1968, the plan was approved just as the government had wished. Later, these conciliatory activities became even more evident as the 1970 presidential elections were drawing near. In December 1969, Luis Figueroa, a member of the Political Commission of the CP and president of the United Workers' Central, Central Única de Trabajadores, CUT, signed an agreement on behalf of this central that included almost all the organized workers accepting a minimum wage of 12 escudos per day. On December 5, El Siglo, daily journal of the CP, had published a paragraph concerning the protracted strike at the FENSA steel plant, saying, quote, "The workers are demanding a raise of 75%, with a minimum of 28 escudos per day, which is hardly enough to live," end quote. Yet, without any mobilization or struggle, they committed all the CUT members to accept, through the compromise signed by Figueroa, a minimum wage of less than half of what they had described as hardly enough to live. Naturally, the agreement signed by Figueroa and the government was warmly praised by the reactionary circles. The journal El Mercurio, mouthpiece of the monopoly bourgeoisie and the American firms, declared on December 5, 1969, quote, "It must be recognized that the agreement, reflects an atmosphere different from that we have been accustomed to during the debates on readjustment. On this occasion, the United Workers' Central has contributed to avoid the atmosphere that it usually takes upon itself to cultivate on such occasions. The said agreement also includes some hope for social peace and a pledge from the CUT leaders," end quote. On the same day, Diario Ilustrado, representing the most reactionary oligarchy, wrote, quote, It is very good to see how easily the government could come to a full agreement with the CUT. It is good because this could mean a sort of entente between the government and the CUT." End quote. For his part, the Minister of the Interior in the Frey government said about the agreement that, quote, "It sets an example in our difficult times for many other sectors which have not yet reached a true understanding. It is for this reason that I wish to express my gratitude to the CUT for its responsibility and seriousness." End quote. Finally, in the middle of 1970, when the workers responded to the decline of their standard of living imposed by the compromise between Figueroa and the government with a national strike, the CP leaders again contrived with the government so that during the strike, any manifestation of fighting spirit would be suppressed in order to make sure that the coming presidential elections would not be prejudiced. On July 9, the president of the governing party said, quote, "The provocateurs of the ultra-left make it necessary to have an agreement between the various political forces for the appropriate completion of the electoral process. Tomorrow, I hope to meet with the radicals, the communists, and the socialists." End quote. On July 16, the same leader stated in La Segunda, quote, "I had discussion with the communists and the socialists concerning the CUT strikes, as well as with the student leaders in order to maintain social peace and not to disturb the order." End quote. The result of these conversations was the intimate collaboration between some CP activists and the police mobile group in directly suppressing the workers who marched in the streets on the day the strike took place in order to stage a more militant protest. The day after the strike, El Siglo, telling the reactionaries how it was capable of stifling the mass struggles, referred to, quote, "the Sunday aspect of the people in districts, people in discussion in the streets and on the sidewalks, children playing, and women taking sunbaths," end quote, during the strike. The pretext continuously used by the CP leaders to suppress any fighting spirit of the masses of the people was that of a, quote, "threatening coup d'etat," end quote, by the ultra-right, which was already unhappy because of the reforms affecting their interests carried out by the Christian Democrats. This threat, just like the fable of the wolf, is used by the CP leaders every time there is an upsurge of the people's struggles. But curiously enough, these Marxists do not use these threats of coup d'etat in order to mobilize the masses and prepare them ideologically and materially so that they can face the alleged putschist attempts, but rather to make them abandon all exaggerated demands and any fighting mobilization, and patiently wait for the presidential elections that will enable them to implement a policy favorable to the people. The CP leaders stuck to such a policy in order to avert the threat, real this time, of a coup d'etat during the Allende administration. We all know the consequences. The difference is that this time, they entrusted the wolf itself, the reactionary armed forces, with the mission of preventing the so dreadful coup d'etat.